Great. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I would love it if you could just give a little intro of yourself, and just some background on, where you've kind of come from and how you got to where you are currently.
Sure. So my name is Simon Huck. I am the co-founder of JUDY, which is an emergency preparedness brand that launched 10 weeks ago. And my background from a career perspective, I've been in entertainment marketing for the last 16 years, headquartered in New York City and had an office in Los Angeles.
Excellent. And so what was to go from entertainment to emergency preparedness? How did that, what was the sort of nexus of that idea?
It's a question I get asked all the time by friends and even family members. When I told them I was launching JUDY, they were just so bewildered by how, celebrity and entertainment would somehow connect with emergency preparedness. But I have had so many different friends and family who've been in emergency situations. I have a ton of friends, unfortunately, who have been affected by the wildfires in Southern California. And I have friends who've experienced what we call domestic emergencies, so fire emergencies. And, some of them have been lucky and have been able to return to their homes. Some have had to rebuild their homes. Some of them still, battle anxiety and trauma from those experiences. And the common denominator in all of these stories was a fundamental lack of preparedness. Not only did they not have an emergency plan, they hadn't even really had those conversations with people in their home about evacuations, about where to go, when you can't return back to your home. So there was this moment where myself and my co-founder, we sat down and he had read this really interesting story about emergency food. And we just started the rabbit hole of researching what brands right now are helping American families or global families think and prepare for all emergencies.
Yeah, so I'd love to understand a little bit more what your research sort of uncovered about the kind of current landscape before you guys launched, because obviously from my perspective, it gets extreme probably pretty quickly
Yeah.
in that space. And so, what were the sort of things that you guys were seeing?
Well, the first thing that we identified, and this was just through kind of light research, speaking to friends of friends who've been in emergencies, we realized there was this fundamental lack of preparedness. Then we started doing the digging, speaking to experts, and discovered that 60% of American families have no emergency plan in place. We discovered that in the last 10 years, 310 million Americans have lived in federally declared disaster areas. And what we also knew, and which is, today's Earth Day, so it feels important to bring it up, that climate change has exacerbated the frequency and the severity of storms. So we are getting more and more less prepared. So we're fundamentally lacking all preparation, and storms are getting worse. So we're more vulnerable. So that was a huge watch out for us. And then when we started researching the different brands and companies and communities that were built around preparedness, you had the prepper community, which didn't appeal to the everyday mom and dad who wanted kind of a fundamental basics of preparation. You had the outdoor adventurer who was looking at preparedness as kind of a 3 days away in the mountains. And then you had the American Red Cross as really the pillar of the emergency kit. And the challenge with the American Red Cross, and I say this with love, it's an incredible organization, but their focus is on blood relief, it's on donation, and then it's on disaster relief. And they have, and as well as FEMA, said publicly that they have failed in their preparedness mission, because getting people prepared, getting people to have those conversations, which are really hard. I know, talking to friends of mine, you're talking about worst case scenario events. Nobody wants to talk about it. It's a dreaded conversation. How do you talk to your kids about evacuating during a fire? And I think what we've seen in COVID-19 has illustrated our reaction as a society to large scale emergencies.
Yeah, absolutely. It gets pretty extreme pretty quickly in terms of how people go from zero to whatever the extreme of that.
Right, you're running down the street hiding toilet paper. It's like, and it happened within almost a 24-hour window where I was coming into my building, the stay at home hadn't been issued, and my lovely neighbor had 3 things of Bounty paper towel and she was stashing it into like the cart. And I thought, wait a minute, this is a person who I've known for 5 years. She's a rational, level-headed thinker, but there is this reaction during large-scale emergencies, which we had talked about in the 18 months of development. Every emergency manager we spoke to said, this is what happens in large-scale emergencies. There's rampant misinformation, there's panic purchasing, and there's levels of anxiety that are difficult to explain to someone who hasn't been in an emergency. And I believed it in theory, but I now, post, and as we're living in COVID right now, realize just the importance of preparation more than I ever did before.
Sure, sure. And I wonder, so with that sort of research as the backdrop, when you guys were thinking about your own offering, what did you sort of key in on as those sort of opportunities to sort of do things differently?
So from a design perspective, we really wanted the physical product to be something that wasn't thrown into your pantry or your basement. So it needed to be designed in a way that could fit into an everyday American household. It couldn't be an eyesore. It also needed to be highly functional. So the biggest pain point around emergency kits, if you go on Amazon or you assemble your own emergency kit, there's no organization. So if you were looking, Scott, for a flashlight in the event of an emergency, or your hand crank radio, and you had 30 seconds to find it, you would never be able to sort through this knapsack that has no compartments, no organization. So we Marie Kondoified emergency kits. So we have 6 cartridges, everything's in the spot that it needs to be in. And then the other challenge is, which is really where the digital product, if you will, comes into play. The biggest walk away from us when we sat with an emergency responder for 2 weeks in LA, and she really helped us kind of think about emergencies in a way that we hadn't thought of before, that education and awareness and the know-how is more important than the physical product. Even though I feel investors sending me, spikes right now, because this is not what they want to hear. But if you take away anything from any conversation around preparedness, is the education of what to do in the event of an emergency. So we knew that education was critical, and we knew that delivering that education, because anyone on the internet right now can access all the things you're supposed to do, but why don't they do it? So figuring out a delivery system and the cadence in which information is delivered was critically important, and quite frankly took the most amount of time in terms of our development.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, I think that's the thing that is, in looking at and going through the way that you guys sort of like approach things on the website, it feels much more accessible than I would imagine. From a sort of user experience, sort of design perspective, putting aside the design of the physical product itself. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the sort of intention behind that, because I mean, obviously, even sort of approaching the category, it can feel overwhelming, and then obviously once you're sort of in the midst of an event where things are a little bit more fraught, then that's obviously a consideration as well.
Well, exactly. I mean, one of the biggest challenges is, we're a small team. And when we get onto our Zoom calls, how do you talk about marketing your product when you're an emergency preparedness product during one of the largest emergencies of our generation? One of the things we know and we learned day one is that you turn off marketing. Like, the traditional marketing is turned off. We have really converted to becoming like an empowering resource, a content system for our community, and really focused on sharing optimistic and positive content. One thing we're hearing time and time again from people in our community is that they need to turn off the news, because it's so much information being thrown at them, some of which is unsubstantiated and only increases their anxiety. And from a digital perspective, in terms of what we're sharing with our community, we have an SMS texting system. So Twice a week, we send out tips and tricks on how to prepare for emergencies. Most of those tips over the last month have been focused on COVID-19. Anything from our tip 3 weeks ago, which is still being shared today, was about designating an errand runner within your home. So if there's 4 people that live in your home, you choose one to go to the grocery store and to the pharmacist. And that became kind of a call to action where people were sharing on social, well, Bob's my errand runner in this household. And it became something that was laser focused. It was actionable and something they could share, that helped them do something, feel like they were doing something to prepare.
Yeah, that's really that's really interesting. I think to your point, it can be a little bit sort of paralyzing to sort of even understand where to kind of begin, and then also, what are the realistic sort of steps that you can kind of take. Um, I'm wondering, I guess, sort of alongside the fact that you guys had launched on the precipice of, this sort of COVID-19 reality that we're all sort of living in right now. How much of, well, I guess let me back up for a second. How are you guys sort of positioning yourselves within the marketplace? Like, what is what's the sort of differentiator in terms of you versus, everybody else that's sort of out there?
So I would look at JUDY, one, from a product perspective. I think that the organization and our direction from a design and curation perspective, we spent 18 months working with emergency experts to figure out what are the products that you need that are global to all emergencies. Second would be, one of the biggest pain points is the organization of these emergency kits. So we made sure to perfect that. And then third, we created the first ever digitally connected emergency kit. So at any time, 24 hours a day, you can text JUDY and we'll get back to you in real time with a response to any of your preparedness questions. So what are the 2 things I need to do to prepare for wildfire season? As wildfire season is upon us in 2 months, these are questions we're getting, every hour. And that is a resource that a lot of people in the community who used to be hesitant at even entering this space, because in order to purchase an emergency kit, you need to have the wherewithal to know you have to prepare. And in order to get there, you have to go through scenarios that most people like to avoid. And that's the challenge. The people who don't want to talk about emergency preparedness think that an emergency will never happen. And then the other subsection of those people think if an emergency does happen, there's nothing they can do to prepare for it. So they don't do anything.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious because I like the sort of layering of that sort of service component onto the product itself. And was that something that you were always planning on having as a sort of component of this, or what was the sort of insight that kind of drove that?
It really wasn't. It was something that developed when we sat with our emergency manager. She's works for JUDY. Her name is Soraya. And I remember sitting in this room and she said, well, emergency kits are critically important, but even more important than emergency kits, you need to have the education, and which you can find online and it's completely free. And I thought, oh goodness, well, that's not what I want to hear. And then we thought long and hard, how do we incorporate education into our physical product? How does JUDY, the physical product, become the centerpiece of that conversation? And what we're hearing from people all across the country who've purchased JUDYs is that JUDY has become the talking point. So your JUDY arrives, you unbox JUDY, and suddenly you're having that conversation with your kids of, what would you do if there was a fire in the kitchen? Let's practice a 2-minute evacuation drill. How do you talk to your kids about COVID-19? And are they going to be able to go to summer camp this summer without scaring them? I mean, there's so much content and information, and just figuring out the cadence of delivery of that information and through what lens has been kind of the everyday challenge for us, and opportunity.
And from a practical point of view, I mean, obviously you mentioned that you have someone who is the sort of guru on staff, so to speak, but is everyone that's sort of currently at the company becoming an expert, so to speak, or how are you kind of creating all that content?
Yeah, so everything goes through our team of emergency managers. So all of our tips and tricks and video content is all developed by emergency managers. But I think, yes, like I'm 18 months into this process. Certainly am not an emergency manager by trade, but as you begin to kind of live and breathe the Judy life, you tend to, I try not to be too preachy, but my fiance has already accused me of being the emergency preparedness freak in the home who's constantly schooling people on what to do and how to use your fire extinguisher. And do you have a fire extinguisher in your kitchen? I think it just becomes kind of a part of your life, especially when you start speaking to people who've been affected by emergencies. I had a friend who was also an editor, and she was going to do a story on Judy. We were supposed to meet on Sunday. This is 6 weeks ago, pre-COVID. And on Saturday night, her home burned to the ground. And she had never been in an emergency before. She had just installed this new fireplace and built out this kind of historic 1920s home. And there was, I guess, a problem with the insulation in her fireplace. And when she smelled smoke, she thought it was just smoke billowing in from the fire, and she had opened a window. And one of the things you learn in basic fire safety is that when you open in a window, the oxygen fuels the fire. And within 20 minutes of her opening that window, the entire home had burnt to the ground. And when you hear a story like that and you think, oh, well, that was a video that we created day 2 of Judy that was sent to all of our customers about basic fire safety, that video would have potentially prevented that situation. And when you start going through those scenarios like that, you start to have goosebumps and you think, wow, this product, the physical product, but also the education can have quite literally a life-saving effect in certain situations.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm curious to know from your perspective, like, who do you have who is your consumer or who is your sort of target with this? I mean, obviously, given the, again, the sort of design of the product, it's, to your point, it's something that is, very modern aesthetics and something that you want to have, on display or not. And the whole kind of like, you describe this like unboxing experience and everything like that. It's very much for, this modern sort of sensibility. And I
Yep.
wonder, who are the people that are buying it, or who did you have in mind sort of initially with this?
So in our initial kind of concepting of Judy, we had the naive approach of Judy is for everyone. And then as we began, which I think everyone starts at that in that place. And then as we began to speak to different people across the country, we realized that Judy was designed really for parents, specifically parents who have kids below the age of 15 years old, who are hypersensitive to personal and family safety. What we've seen in terms of trend lines and changes kind of pre and post COVID, right now we're seeing a ton of young millennials or mid-aged millennials purchasing Judys for their parents, purchasing Judys for their grandparents, and sending them as gifts. So I think what's really interesting, and I think we're still figuring out now, is how is COVID going to change the consumer habits for us in the next 6 months. I think every single person, being under a stay-at-home order is now considering what that looks like and what are some of the products they wish they had for peace of mind, going forward.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, speaking from my own experience and someone who generally feels relatively prepared, I definitely went down a rabbit hole that was sort of facilitated by some targeted ad about some survival kit or something
Right,
like that.
right.
And then,
Totally.
it just made me wonder, like, oh, what am I doing? What am I doing wrong in my life?
Right. No, and that's really the challenge for us, is making sure that the products, and I think some of the messaging in the emergency preparedness community uses fear. And we have learned immediately that any sort of fear-based tactics actually shut the customer down completely from the category. So, instincts are that, oh, well, fear will drive the sale. But in our case, our customer wants optimism. They want to feel empowered and they want the peace of mind. So, we have been very careful with how we talk about our product.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I like that sort of notion of the sort of empowerment piece. I wonder if sort of alongside of that, you can talk a little bit, and I know it's sort of built into some of the things that you've been mentioning, but one of the things I'm seeing, and obviously this was sort of before all of this was happening, but you mentioned this idea of trusted sort of information, and um, I know just in terms of how are you guys like sort of putting that trust and sort of credibility front and center? And I know you're sort of doing that through a lot of the services, but I wonder if you can just speak to that a little bit more as well.
Well, it's an interesting question. It's something that we talked about at the very beginning of JUDY when we first launched around just all emergency information and what is the lens in which that information goes through, from the time that we develop it to the time that it reaches our community. We were very careful, and we continue to be very careful of sharing any information that hasn't been blessed by the CDC or the World Health Organization or our local health authorities. Because what you've seen over the course of the past 6 weeks is that information that was sent out on Friday may not be relevant on Monday, and it's ever changing. And so speculation actually only increases the anxiety. So people in our community want to know that this information is coming from a local health authority and it's been substantiated, because if it's not, you end up, and I had this with friends, I said, guys, you need to take me off these group chats. I'm in the emergency business and you're making me anxious because you're sending me opinion pieces, you're sending me information from a variety of sources. So we have been really careful that any of the information, whether it's our tips, our videos, is coming from the World Health Organization, the CDC, or our local government authority, because you can find yourself having to go back and edit your own content. Oh, that information I shared on Tuesday is actually not relevant and is misleading. And you don't want to be doing that to a community that's really looking to you as the lens of all of their information.
Yeah, absolutely. It is interesting that you say that because it's so true. Like, I mean, all brands have to be conscious of what they're sort of putting out into the marketplace. But when you are in the business of helping people feel sort of safe and prepared, then it's even sort of more so a consideration to have.
Yep.
I mean, you hinted at this a little bit, but I'm curious. Um, as I mean, obviously, in some ways, this was an amazing time to launch. I mean, I know, it's you don't want to say that given everything that's happening, but it's also changed so much, as you've sort of hinted at. But is there anything that you've beyond some of the things that you've talked about that you learned sort of I mean, you're in the process of sort of building this brand and sort of seeing the products, and then this hits, and then what have you seen that's been surprising or has made you think differently?
I think I was not necessarily a naysayer, but when I sat through kind of the 18 months of learning around emergency preparedness and behaviors around emergency management, I didn't necessarily believe that all of that would occur in every large scale emergency. I had been in several hurricanes. I was here during Sandy. I didn't realize how important remaining calm and being prepared and education was to really keeping your mindset and your mind clear of kind of that negative energy, which I have so many different people in the community, in our community, certainly at JUDY, and just friends of mine who've been deeply impacted by not just the reality of COVID-19 living in New York City, but also just the kind of the mental strain that this has put on so many different people because they have really let themselves go into this black hole of information. So the biggest learning for us is preparedness is so critically important. So it's really gone back to our mission that preparing American families and this mission to kind of empower people with information is more critical than it ever has been before.
And as you guys sort of, and again, I recognize it's still very early days, but as you think about the sort of current offering that's in the marketplace now and where that potentially, could go 6 months from now, a year from now, how are you guys thinking in terms of growing or extending what it is that that you're currently doing?
So we have just a whole slew of products in development right now. You can imagine that if we're preparing you for emergencies, we're also preparing you for the first day of college. We're preparing you and your pets for an emergency. We're preparing, for some of life's big moments. So in our mind, given what we're seeing in terms of storms, the frequency of storms, there is no reason that from a retail perspective, just like there's a travel section where you have travel size containers of every product, there would be no reason why there should not be a preparedness section in each and every store, whether it's a department store or a pharmacy. So we're building out products, anything from food products. Right now, there's shelf stable emergency food in your JUDY. I won't lie to you that the flavor profile isn't fabulous, although some people tell us they love it and they were eating it during this emergency now. We're working on developing a JUDY meal replacement bar that would run on subscription. So part of the emergency kit challenge is that there's consumables in your emergency kit. So food, water, some of the first aid kit products. And then you have expirables. So some of these things are actually expiring and need to be replenished. So we're building out right now a subscription program. So you would be emergency ready 365 days a year, and we could send those products to you kind of on a pull push system to make sure that your emergency kit was always ready.
That's awesome. That makes a lot of sense in that respect, because I mean, obviously that's the, the fear is that you buy one of these things and then you don't have to use it until you do, and that stuff is some of the things are no longer
Are
sort of,
no longer. Yep.
yeah, yeah. And I like the way that you talk about, I mean, you've already sort of talked about this as preparedness as being sort of a very emotional sort of context, but then pivoting to sort of thinking of the other emotional sort of life-changing moments that we have that are fraught, but maybe less emergency point of view, but how that's potentially ways that you can sort of think about preparedness in a much larger sort of context.
Right. Exactly.
That's great. Well, that was sort of the final question that I had. Is there anything else that I haven't touched on that you want to bring up in the context of our conversation?
No, this has been great. I'm so happy to spend the time with you. Thank you for having
Yeah,
me.